Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Center for Humanities Research. I'd also really like to welcome our guest interlocutors, Professor Crane Sudin and Professor Saths Cooper. As many of you know, my name is Luando Scott, and I'm a senior researcher here at the Center for Humanities Research, and I will be the chair for you this evening. Um, Professor Cooper, as you can see, he couldn't make it, so he's joining us via satellite. Um, Thank you, Prof, for availing yourself. And we did pray to the technology gods that everything will go right tonight. So tonight's proceedings, we will give Moritz about 15 to 20 minutes to speak. And then Professor Cooper will respond, and then Professor Sudin will also respond. Round about, give or take, 10 minutes each, but we will see how the discussion goes. So tonight is a very special evening as we are launching the book of one of our colleagues at the center, Associate Professor Maurits van Bever Donker, whose new book with Polity Press is titled Textured Difference, Black Consciousness Philosophy and the Script of Man. Tonight we are here to applaud you on sharing your ideas and to congratulate you on publishing this book. But of course, by publishing this book, you also open yourself up to scrutiny. So we are here to ask you many, many questions. Moritz's work specializes in Black consciousness philosophy and negritude, particularly how the philosophy of Black consciousness constitutes a notion of the subject through the aesthetic, what he calls the retraining of the senses. This book that we are launching here today is located at the intersection of post-colonial and critical theory, literature, and philosophy, where South African Black consciousness movement meets international anti-colonial thought. The CHR as an intellectual space takes seriously interdisciplinarity, and this comes through in Moritz's book, Textured Difference, in the ways in which Moritz weaves different disciplines and forces them to have conversations with each other. Moritz, of course, wears many hats other than book writer. As you all know, he is the newly appointed director of the Center for Humanities Research. And I suppose very soon we are going to have to stop saying new. He is taking over, of course, from the fantastic Associate Professor Hedy Groenewald, who held the position for the past 5 years. He also convenes the new research platform in the CHR called the New Ecologies of the Subject, which we are all very excited about. In this book, Moritz is grappling with the question of freedom in the post-apartheid moment. He is asking questions about the conditions for a society after apartheid, what he calls nation to come. According to Yale Kisikudi, who wrote the preface to Moritz's book, Textured Difference, I quote, "The coming society requires a total negation of everything that made apartheid possible, that gave rise to it, and which it in turn nourished, as well as the ever-present danger that it might resurface. The coming society has yet to arrive, but the conditions for its imminent arrival are decipherable, knowable." Not sure how I agree with her on that. It is these conditions that Moritz labors on in this book: the potential, the possibility, and decoding from the Black consciousness movement. Over the past year, the CHR, we have been thinking about the danger of that return, or what might return, what Professor Primesh Lalu has been calling the uncanny return. If the state of the world is anything to go by, maybe the return is already here. Here then, we should take heed of Yale Kisikudi's words that as we navigate the political imagination that combat racism, we must learn, underscore, than to accept the discomfort of aporias and paradoxes we are living with as we think up new strategies of surviving the current world. In conversation with Maurits tonight is Professor Seth Cooper and Professor Crane Sudin, as I've mentioned. Professor Cooper is extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria and Stellenbosch. He has a PhD in clinical/community psychology from Boston University. Professor Cooper was the president of the Pan-African Psychology Union, PAPU, the International Union of Psychological Science, and the Psychological Society of South Africa. It is perhaps no surprise that Professor Cooper is one of the interlocutors tonight, considering the topic of conversation being Black consciousness philosophy, which of course was championed by Steve Biko. Considering that Professor Cooper was not only part of the Azanian People's Organization, AZAPO, between 85 and 86, but was also a close colleague of the late Steve Biko. Professor Cooper was banned and house arrested when he was 22, and he was jailed for 9 years. Professor Cooper, we look forward to your interventions on this new book, on the ideas of Steve Biko and the Black consciousness movement, some 40 years after Steve Biko's death. Also in conversation with Maurits tonight is Professor Crane Sudin, who really does not need any introduction in this crowd, because his work is influential on how we think about race, transformation, and culture. And he has been influential in enabling us to see how a combination of these affects South Africa's education in the post-apartheid moment. Professor Sudin is Emeritus Professor in the School of Education and Honorary Professor at the Center for African Studies, both at the University of Cape Town. He is a former Chief Executive Officer of the Human Sciences Research Council and also formerly a Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Cape Town. Professor Sudin has published widely on education and transformation, poverty and inequality, globalization and education. But I want to focus maybe on the book, The Cape Radicals. In the book, Professor Sudin focuses on the intellectual and political thought of the New Era Fellowship, where he argues that in 1937, a group of young Capetonians, through public discourse, lectures, study circles, sowed the seeds of radical thinking that would challenge normative politics of the day. Now, in this short biography of Professor Sudin I've laid out, you can see why he makes a perfect interlocutor for tonight's book launch on Black consciousness philosophy. Because while Black consciousness is particular, it is also part of a constellation of Black thinkers. Black here in a political sense, of course. Like the New Era Fellows, like Marxist reading groups in townships hiding away from the apartheid state, like many others that had a sense of the cosmopolitan, a bigger world than apartheid South Africa, people who inhabited a kind of worldliness and refused what Professor Primesh Lalu often calls gutter education from the apartheid state, a refusal that many paid for with their very lives, including, of course, Steve Biko himself. But of course, for Biko, even in his death, is a refusal. So in reading Texture Difference, there is a call for a reckoning, that any effective reckoning with the persistence of apartheid requires that the terrain on which the subject of apartheid is lodged be unsettled. In this book, we are asked to attend to apartheid's conceptual terrain in order to be able to arrive at something akin to freedom in the post-apartheid moment. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, and many of us in between, please help me welcome the man of the hour, Maurits van Bever Donker.
Wow. After After such an introduction, I don't think any of us actually want to speak anymore. We can just draw a line under the evening. So thank you, everybody, for coming to this book launch. The most surprising part of it is that I discovered that apparently I've written a book. Um, Please turn your cell phones off. So, in saying a few things about the book, I'm going to first talk about how I arrive at this point of having published this book, this one, in case you haven't seen it, and then talk a little bit about what the book tries to do. So there are many. I spent hours, more hours than I probably should have, trying to think through how to frame an introduction to my book. I decided to start in the Eastern Cape with Pramesh and Kaya and Shanaz visiting the graves of Sahili and Hinsa. This was 2004, winter 2004, probably July actually. Um, Working on Pramesh's book, The Deaths of Hinsa, and learning that reading extends beyond the particularity of the text. That reading the text also reads the social and the space in which that text is conceived and that structures it. In my master's studies, which I did with Pramesh on non-Hausa and the cattle killing movement in the mid 19th century, I began to ask the question of the disciplinary lines that produce subjects that subjectivate people, not just what or how a person is in the world, but how it is that they come to self-identify along those lines. And this was in the process of trying to figure out the role of irony and play in the writing of history, and realizing that the discipline of history was not adequate to the task of dealing by itself to the question of subjectivation. And interestingly, this is when I started thinking of the discipline as a site from which to ask a question rather than a space in which to inhabit in order to figure out the answer. And that's a gentle shove, is maybe the word to put, that Crane actually gave me. You probably don't even know this. In 2004, there was a conference in town. I was working on my project on my honors project on spaces of intersection in uh, urban historiography in Cape Town, and we were talking about what do I do, what do you do? You're in education, and that's when this conversation about thinking of a discipline as a site from which to launch an inquiry. Um, so I then moved from Cape Town to the US, to Minnesota, where I did my PhD with Kadri Ismail. And that move was largely because of reading his book, Abiding by Sri Lanka, which again is another piece in the wheel of where I've learned how to read. The question of abiding by a text, abiding by the problem that the text addresses. Um, that was also a shift away from history and towards literature as my disciplinary site. And I think when you read the book, I hope you read the book, um, there will be you'll see how I blend the literary and the historical and the political to kind of texture the questions. There, I took a class on modernism with Janie Skandura, who's a leading scholar on the Harlem Renaissance and dirt in the Harlem Renaissance. And in taking that class, reading Aimé Césaire alongside um, Derrida, I came to the realization that there was very little in Derrida that wasn't already in Aimé Césaire's writings, which is not to make an argument of priority, right? What was interesting to me wasn't that maybe Derrida read Césaire, but the interesting question for me was that these political movements, like negritude, which have always been treated as political, were already asking deeply philosophical questions around subjectivity and how you become activated as subjects. And I started thinking, well, maybe it would be interesting to read these movements along those philosophical lines. Which brings me to this book, which has been a long time in the making. It's a book about what I would call a both and rather than an either or. As Loando was saying, it's about staying at that difficult point of the aporia. Since my teen years, now I'm going to age myself, in the late 90s, actually it was the 12th of September 1997, so 20 years after the death of Biko, one of my teachers, James Bissett, did a tribute to Biko, in which what I took from that was the rescuing of thought in the midst of education. And that's kind of really shaped my approach to this book. So this book, Texturing Difference. I'll get to the, thank you, Luanda, to the subtitle in a little bit. Difference, so in the book I read people like Biko, Fanon, Césaire, Sobukwe, etc., Sylvia Winter, Horton Spillers, who are all coming to these questions in different ways globally. But difference in the book isn't the problem. Difference as such isn't the problem, right? The problem is what we might call Europe's difference or apartheid's difference. It's a difference that is inscribed as a ground of being rather than just different, right? So this ground of being, whether understood through the problematic of hierarchy, so master slave, as in the colonial situation, or development, as in separate development of the apartheid state, or even diversity, as in recognizing the ontological character of difference as but yet equal in that difference, right? All three of those hinge on the sense of difference as an ontological ground, as the ground of being. So that's the problem of difference that the book tries to deal with. And yet the mechanism of one's exclusion or one's inclusion cannot be easily dismissed or ignored. And that's where the concept of texturing comes in to the equation. So texturing or texture stems from the Latin texere. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. If there's a Latinist here, they can correct me. Which means to weave. And so in a certain sense, what the book does is it looks at the weaves that have produced us as subjects, but also the kind of counter weaves that allow us to read and work against and unravel the weaves that we are trapped in. Texturing, so it's the web, it's the text, right? It's the texture, but it's also that act of texturing as in the sense of adding something to, adding definition, complicating the problem. So in a certain way, what the book tries to do is also complicate difference. So it's abiding in that sense by the problem. The cover art of the book, which you're not going to be able to see very well, but you're going to have to buy yourself a copy. It's actually worth sorry, I didn't throw it on the ground on purpose. It's worth buying the book just to have a copy of Bernie Sewell's artwork, Lifeline, which is valuable. Probably more valuable than the book itself. No, but so Bernie's work has been a really important and formative part of the way that I think about the body and race. And this work in particular, which is divided into, it's the palm of a hand taken into 24 segments, each segment representing an hour of the day, right? So it's the totality of life. And the palm is stained with ink, the ink of labor. And marks the history of the slave trade and how people, the trade in bodies, but also the work of empire, etc., and how it makes subjectivities. And it recalls Aimé Césaire's description of the way in which the racialized black body is at the heart of making the world in Return to the Native Land, where he says, "Not 1 inch of this world devoid of my sooty fingerprint," looking at both how, we know, which invokes labor, invokes slavery, invokes many, many things. My list goes on and on and on. But Luando has things to do tonight, so I can't talk for too long. So her artwork also asks how difference is produced, how it is we've come to perceive difference in particular ways, and how to read those lives, and then what those lines of difference, and then what futures become possible after that work of reading has been done. And that brings me to the content of the book. So I am kind of I'm narrowing down, and I'll be done talking very soon, I promise. So I read Black consciousness philosophy as offering an approach for exiting Europe's great game, to paraphrase Fanon in Wretched of the Earth. And I suggest in the book that it's time to listen to the inventiveness, the invention in that approach. So there are different ways to think of how I approach this in the book. The first is somewhat, one thing after the other in a way. I begin by diagnosing apartheid as, among other things, a project of producing race. So rather than just administering race, it actually seeks to produce a racial consciousness, and particularly producing self-recognizing racial subjects. And I argue that one of its main mechanisms for doing that is through this concept of community. And then moving from there, I look at the limits of resistance to this that brought, and so there is where I'm reading people like Jeremy Cronin and Mongani Sorote and others, as well as the Freedom Charter. And I look at the role of community in these projects and how the difficulty with needing to do a theory or a politics by all means, and yet running up against the mechanism that the apartheid state was itself using to produce racialized subjects. And that brings me into a much more global picture. So from there, I look at the liberal philosopher Hernley and his reliance on Kantian concepts of the world. And I really move us into a kind of what we might call a realm of modern philosophy. So it's not a problem just of apartheid. It's actually a problem of the constitution of the modern world. In that global frame, I then move to look at how the weave might be woven that can unpick this. And that's where I start working through the interventions of figures like Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, particularly through the way that they rework concepts of indigeneity and tactility, respectively. And I bring that round full circle into Black consciousness philosophy. In the final chapter of the book, I read this through the lens of South Africa, so to speak. Whereas Blackness, as it's generally thought, and the key signal here would be Spiller's Critical Age of Black Culture, for example, which is uncannily similar to Biko's definitions of Blackness in his work. Although it takes its point of departure as the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage. And I begin to ask the question, what kinds of possibilities are possible if we approach this question from the African continent rather than from the diaspora? And that is then an attempt to read Black consciousness, to examine the contours of the invention of a more human face. So that's one way to read the book. And I do this, and this is an argument that I make in the book. But another way is to also approach the subtitles. And how am I going for time, by the way? I've only got about another half an hour. So the second way is to approach this by answering the questions of its subtitles. What is Black consciousness philosophy? What is the script of man? And the script of man is, I argue in the book, the terrain on which our modernity is inscribed. And I mean terrain in an almost an agricultural sense. It's what gives life to our modernity. And a key element in this is the mechanism of race, but also the mechanisms of gender and class. And the work of Colette Guillemot is really important in showing how these three interact and are then presented as, social constructions that are presented as biological or natural. Within that system, the mechanism of race, whiteness and blackness operates as a differential to produce man. So man becomes the end goal of modernity. And this is very much, I draw on the work of Fanon in making this argument, but also Sylvia Wynter. Race in that becomes a claim. It becomes a claim of Europe on the world. It's a claim to hold modernity. It's a claim to own the emancipatory project of man. As if freedom was a European, or equality were European concepts. And I find the work of Siba Gravugi really, really useful in kind of setting out why we should stop giving Europe as much credit as Europe wants to claim for itself. This is not to argue we must provincialize Europe, but actually we need to recognize that what Europe's trying to do is claim something that isn't its own. The revolution that produces equality, fraternity, and I forget, liberty. I knew there was another one. It slips out the window, especially these days. Was a global revolution, even though it happened in France. This is Gary Wilder's argument. So it's not enough to declare, so in this whole process, it's not enough to declare something as racist when we're dealing with the script of man, as if, you're going to read Immanuel Kant and discover that he was racist and be shocked and horrified. Rather, we need to understand the function of race in the system. And this leads me to examine community in apartheid, the role of race in modern philosophy, and the limit of community as a response. And specifically why people like Biko and Sobukwe refuse race and rather speak of concepts like Africanity and black. And that brings me to Black consciousness philosophy. So what is Black consciousness philosophy? In the book, I keep wanting to refer to it as a novel. It's very well written. It's lovely. I shouldn't say, I was going to say it's not as well written as a novel. I did my best, guys. Black consciousness begins from the site where thought breaks down, the body. It asks what mechanisms connect us to and reduce us to our bodies, both black and white. In Biko's language, a non-white or a white cannot resist apartheid. A non-white person or a white person cannot resist apartheid, because those subject positions affirm the differential that itself needs to be broken. But it also draws its urgency precisely from the weight of the body. And I think that's really important to hold on to. So it's not a case of evacuating race as though we can just, as certain people in the US want to disband diversity, equity, and inclusion projects, because if you don't name race, then suddenly race doesn't exist. And we all know that's a fantasy, right? The urgency of the intervention stems from the weight of the body in the world. So I suggest that there is a unique intervention from the point of view of Africa, a possibility to invent and to set afoot a new man. And a critical aspect in this is the work of what I call reading, of the literary kind of edge of Black consciousness as a philosophy, and is of abiding by the site of objectivation in order to question. So I attend to the literary, to the philosophical, to the political, to show how this reading is both performed and taught in that performance. And in that, I try to show how this holds the future as open, as being ordered by an ethics of reading that is not unworthy of the event, of, you know, not just the moments that impinge on us, but the moments that produce us. So I'm not sure. I agree with you. I'm not sure that I agree with Yala 100% that the lines for the future are apparent. But an attitude of reading, an attitude of inquiry, we might be able to learn that from people like Biko and Sebulkwe and others, and Fanon and Césaire, to make a future possible. To close on Fanon, and this is what he closes Black Skin, White Masks with, is a prayer. He says, "Oh, my body, always make me a man who questions. From the site where thought ends, that's where the question has to begin." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maurits. Over to you, Professor Cooper.
Thank you very much. I think that Maurits somewhere calls this work a monograph. And what he mentioned now complicates difference. And what complicates his fairly thoughtful and studied approach, bringing in a clutch of different thinkers and writers, is his quite long introduction. But it is almost a schooling, if you like, in creating a Prussian bed of interlinkage between humanities, social sciences, and his own choice of different works of literature. That reading, which he gives a particular set of meanings to. So just when I was getting quite infuriated with some of the concepts he's mentioned, like community, and thinking, now I'm going to hammer him on including X's work and the conclusion he's going to reach. I find I'm unsettled because he covers those bases. So he'll take something that is fairly dyed-in-the-wool, centrist, liberal, if not quite racist, and finds a common thread with community in the sense that most of us understood community from our birth into the period of serious opposition against apartheid, and then the advent of democracy. And probably, I'll be very kind, within 10 years, that sense of community that we knew broke down. It does not just exist out there. So there's probably a bit of inflation in his exploration of literature, but it's a necessary exploration because most of us come to other thought through some kind of literature, if not song, poetry, and other ways of thinking and out loud or silently. In that, Maurits, you have succeeded in weaving a necessary tapestry for understanding ourselves in relationship to the big European dominance, which you're saying we should not provincialize. And I'm going to deal with that in a minute. And significantly, you deal with reification. That's from the Latin word reus, thing. But I'm going to quote one of your Deleuze and Guattari at the beginning of the Black Consciousness chapter. This is not reassuring because you can botch it. And I think in a very meaningful way, throughout your writing, you have been aware that you can botch it if you overstep the mark. And in some senses, you probably did because you got caught up in the writing about the reading. So this is, colleagues, not an easy read, but it is a necessary, required read to actually make sense of ourselves wherever we may be in our heads and in our spaces. And at this critical juncture, 35 years after Mandela's release. So I'm going to, instead of quoting too many of the things that I've found intriguing and your explanations and your descriptions using Wally Sorote's work with the two white protagonists and explaining those in the terms which we would have used in the late 60s and into the 70s. The point that I think needs to be explored in your follow-up is the appellation, is the naming. And while you may want to have us distantiate ourselves from the colonial, and specifically from the European, and by extension, some of the American, how we use words do have sense and meaning. And when the term non-white is used in the book, in your monograph, it goes back to reification because white becomes a point of departure. And I know you did not intend that, but essential to the thinking on Black consciousness, which is almost exorcised from our thinking, from our visible engagements in whatever fields we are in our spaces. When I describe these glasses, I cannot describe them as non-book. I have to describe these glasses in terms of which it is made up, and actually that texturing difference underpinning that quest for humanity affirms all of us. I know there's a lot of return to some recidivist thinking in our media over time. And the term Black now has been reduced to an ethnic color differential. But in its original meaning and in its expression by many of us, it means affirming self. And it does not mean what the liberals and what others said of us, that it's anti-white. If you're pro-Black, it's anti-white. So I would, in exploring this further, urge you to ditch that which previously, and if you go to the Cape Radicals and others, non-European and then non-white, and that advent of Black using a negative connotation, dark, terrible, etc., and putting it as a positive, even though when Crane and I may describe ourselves as Black, there'll be others who think, but you're not Black. in the same way that Judge Bossoff raised with Steve, but you are not black. And he retorted, but you are not white. There is that area that you in particular, bringing all these different strains connected, and in a time when our very future trajectory of science, education, thinking is turned on its head. I think what you've done here, you can conclude